on Global Affairs. We're delighted to welcome back Stephen Kinzer for a discussion that will cover a few hundred years of history and maybe some in the future as well. For nearly a century, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs has provided an independent, nonpartisan platform for a variety of different voices to promote deeper and global engagement throughout the world. Views expressed by individuals we host are their own, and they do not represent institutional positions or views of the Council. We are live streaming tonight. We're on the record, so please silence your phones, but please feel free to also to use social media. We have hashtags, I think, on that screen. The Council hosts over 150 programs a year, most of which take place here in this conference center. Some upcoming highlights include a debate on human rights on February 15th with Ian Hurd of Northwestern University and Eric Posner from University of Chicago's Law School. On February 23rd, we'll discuss the future of jobs in the workforce with Steve Pemberton from Walgreens Boots Alliance, Rick Wartzman from Claremont University, and futurist Amy Webb. And on March 10th, we'll host our 5th annual International Women's Day Global Health Symposium. We're covering many, many other regions and topics, so please do check out our website and our Facebook feed, which has quite a lot of them as well. Turning back to this evening's program, following the prepared remarks, we will take the questions through hand raising and microphones in the room, but also through our online app, which is labeled up there. chi.cnf.io is the browser link. Please go ahead and log into that now. You can put in questions now and throughout the evening. We'll ask them later on tonight. Stephen Kinzer's book will also be available for purchase and signing from our friends and partners, the bookseller, right over here following the program. And finally, to formally introduce our speaker, please join me in welcoming a longtime supporter of the Council, longtime educator on important global issues, and current President's Circle member, Sheldon Marcus.
Well, thank you, John, for that kind introduction and also for taking care of all the housekeeping so I don't have to do it. And also thanks to the Council for giving me this opportunity to introduce Stephen Kinzer to Chicago audiences for the third time, one time here and another time at the Chicago Humanities Festival. Let us begin with a quote from our guest, Stephen Kinzer. This is from a transcript of his NPR radio interview with Terry Gross last week, so it's very current. And I quote, "All foreign policy decisions by the United States come down to one word. All choices boil down to one word, and it is intervention." Unquote. I just want you to know when I'm stopping quoting him and talking myself here. In this era of fake news and alternate facts, we can put those both in quotation marks, we need such objective and forceful journalism, such as exemplified in that quote. And Stephen Kinzer has consistently given us that. We'll come back to this in a moment, but first a little biographical information. Stephen is Senior Fellow at the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University and columnist at the Boston Globe. He formerly was a correspondent and bureau chief for the New York Times. And what isn't shown on the bio information up here is that he brings us real combat experience and the benefit of that perspective. And when he speaks of intervention, he knows where from he speaks. So let us continue to look at what Stephen brings to us tonight, and I propose to do that with examples from his own words. Stephen brings us a probing and analytical journalistic method. And continuing to quote from the interview with Terry Gross, quoting our guest, "These instincts coexist within us. We're imperialists, but we're also isolationists." Unquote. Stephen brings learnings from the past and applies them to the present. And again, quoting, "In 1898, the United States burst from being a continental empire within North America to taking territory overseas for the first time." And continuing quoting, "What I, Stephen Kinzer, realized is that we made this decision after a huge national debate. Every major political and intellectual figure took sides in this debate. This is the subject of the latest of his many books, The True Flag, which is the subject of his presentation this evening." Stephen is not afraid to dig out the facts and present them clearly, and he is not afraid to bring out the racist tendencies in our foreign policy. Again, quoting from the interview, as it was argued back in 1898, some people are ready for self-government, others are not and need our help. What we're really saying is white people can govern themselves while others are not capable of it. That's not his opinion, that is what was the opinion of the time in 1898. Stephen is not afraid to reveal the consequences of our actions. And again, quoting, interventions aimed at peacekeeping often deteriorate because peacekeepers are not seen as peacekeepers by many of the people on the ground. And he is not afraid to relate all this to who we are as a people. And the last quote from the interview, in many places in the world, we crashed into a country that was reasonably democratic and left it under tyranny. But that doesn't sound right to us. That doesn't seem like the story we want to believe about ourselves. So those episodes fade away and become footnotes to history, whereas those that come out well are celebrated eternally as the perfect epitome of who we are and what we do. Stephen Kinzer is, and this is end of quote, Stephen Kinzer is a role model for responsible journalism. So please join me in welcoming Stephen back to the Chicago Council.
We have never had a president before who was destitute of self-respect and of respect for his high office. We have had no president before who was not a gentleman. We've had no president before who was intended for a butcher, a dive keeper, or a bully. Our president is clearly insane and the most formidable disaster that has befallen the country since the Civil War. No, that is not a quote from this week. That's Mark Twain talking about Theodore Roosevelt. This wonderful debate that they had is the debate that is still consuming us as a nation. Actually, Mark Twain and Theodore Roosevelt were deliciously matched opponents in this debate. They were, in many ways, remarkably similar. They were both fervent patriots who believed that America had a sacred mission on earth, but they saw that mission very differently. Theodore Roosevelt believed the United States was destined to dominate the world and that this would be good for everybody. Mark Twain had traveled in many places to see the results of imperialism. He had been in South Africa, he had been in the South Sea Islands in the Pacific, and had seen the results for native peoples of what intervention meant. So he was very sympathetic to the victims of intervention. He even supported the Chinese who were fighting the Boxer Rebellion. They were portrayed in the US as nothing but wild savages devoted to slitting the throats of priests and raping nuns. But Mark Twain thought they were great, and he said, the Chinese have been villainously dealt with by the sceptered thieves of Europe. I hope they expel all the foreigners and keep them out for good. Theodore Roosevelt replied that the person who loves another country as much as he loves his own country is as despicable a member of society as a man who loves other women as much as he loves his own wife. So both of them were thinkers and writers as well as activists, but most important, both Theodore Roosevelt and Mark Twain were born performers. They created their own image. Neither one of them could turn away from a camera or an interviewer. They were acutely aware of each other's popularity, so they didn't directly criticize each other in public. But we do know from their own private writings and comments what they thought of each other. Roosevelt, for example, famously told a group of friends that he would like to skin Mark Twain alive. So the debate between these two popular American figures reflects the moment when the United States made what is probably the most profound decision in American history. When this debate began in the US Senate at the beginning of 1899, one senator addressed the chamber and said, "This is the greatest question that has ever been presented to the American people." And I think he was right. In a way, it is even greater than the question of slavery, because the slavery question only affected people living inside the United States. The question of whether the US should become a global power and begin projecting its coercive force around the world affected everybody. So let me try to set the scene and then talk about the episode that I've tried to recover from history in my new book. The story of the Spanish-American War is fairly well known to that little tiny group of us that actually focus on the history of that period, but I don't think it's very well known to Americans. Essentially, it was this. Cuban revolutionaries had been fighting for several years to overthrow Spanish colonialism. At the beginning of 1898, the great demagogic newspaper publisher William Randolph Hearst decided that he would like to whip up a war fervor in the United States based on what he considered to be the atrocities committed by the Spanish colonialists in Cuba. Hearst had built up a media empire and was selling hundreds of thousands of copies of his New York Journal every day. But with the insight of an entrepreneur, he realized that in order to get people to buy a newspaper every day, you need a running story, not just another suicide or another child tragedy or another story of political corruption, as were the staples of his newspaper. War is the best running story of all. So Hearst set out to give the American public a steady diet of super jingoistic rhetoric and graphic reporting that would drive them wild with interventionist fervor. And I've spent now many hours going through those old newspapers, and it's truly impressive to see how effective fake news was in those days. For example, there's a brilliant story graphically illustrated by a correspondent who is writing about the suffering of starving Cubans being held in holding pens, and talks about how he has actually watched some of them die in front of his own eyes. We now realize that that reporter had never even been in Cuba. But that didn't matter. Americans are very compassionate people. We hate the idea that anybody's suffering anywhere. And whenever our leaders want us to intervene in some country in the world, they quickly show us a picture of somebody who's been mutilated for wanting to go to school, or some victims of some atrocity, and say that means we have to intervene. And that was first done by William Randolph Hearst. Then came the great moment of the Spanish-American War when our warship, the USS Maine, was blown up in Havana Harbor. Then you see the classic front page, maybe the most important front page in American history. Explosion of the Maine was the work of an enemy, is the banner headline. And then there's a large diagram on the front page that shows how the Spanish attached the mine. You see the Maine sitting in the water, and below the waterline, there's a diagram showing where the mine was placed, and the cord that connects it to the detonator on shore is clearly delineated. 70 years later, the U.S. Navy convened an investigating board under Admiral Hyman Rickover, which concluded that the USS Maine was destroyed by an internal explosion in the boiler. There was no enemy, there was no detonator, there was no mine. But it worked. So William Randolph Hearst was the megaphone for the imperialists. Theodore Roosevelt was their great public figure. He was the person who had captured American imagination. And the third member of the Jingo Troika was Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. He was really the organizer behind the scenes of the whole project. It was he who conceived the idea that the United States should dominate the world and manipulated Roosevelt, McKinley, and others in that era, finally achieved a tremendous success. Now, as we were fighting the Spanish in Cuba, the Cuban revolutionaries were reluctant to accept our help at first. They were afraid of what it might mean to have a lot of American troops in Cuba. As a result, to calm them down, the American Congress passed a law, the Teller Amendment, guaranteeing that as soon as Cuba was independent from Spain, we would go home and allow it to become free. As we were doing this, we were looking for the Spanish fleet. We wanted to destroy the Spanish fleet wherever it was to be sure it wouldn't come and attack the US when we entered Cuba. We found out that the Spanish fleet was in a place almost no American had ever heard of. That was the Philippine Islands. So we sent a squadron, and it destroyed the Spanish fleet in the Philippines, but then we didn't know what to do with the Philippines. Do we let them become independent? Do we take them ourselves? Do we just take a port or an island? So at the end of 1898, the U.S. imposed on Spain a treaty that was called the Treaty of Paris. Under this treaty, Spain surrendered all of its island territories, Guam, Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. The United States paid Spain $20 million for the Philippines to make them feel a little bit better. And with that, we decided, at President McKinley's ruling, that we should become an imperial power. McKinley was tormented about this. He didn't know what to do. And sometime around October of 1898, we don't know the exact day, he had what was probably the most influential, important divine visitation in the history of American politics. In the middle of the night, he got down on his knees and prayed to God, and he said God told him that the United States should annex the entire Philippine Islands and Christianize them, not perhaps realizing that having been the colony of Spain for several centuries, they were largely Catholic already. Certainly, on that night, God sounded a lot like Henry Cabot Lodge and Theodore Roosevelt. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, the Senate debate began. So the Treaty of Paris, by which the United States committed itself to becoming an overseas empire, to take our first colonies, had to be ratified by the U.S. Senate. And on January 2nd, 1899, President McKinley submitted it to the U.S. Senate. Now, by this time, something had happened that dramatically changed the political landscape in the United States, and it's something that really has been lost to history. Starting in Boston, a big anti-imperialist movement emerged, and almost all of the great political figures of the age signed up, at least on one side or the other. So I mentioned that Roosevelt, Hearst, and Lodge were the imperialist group. On the anti-imperialist side, you had really quite an impressive group. Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in America, was a fervent anti-imperialist. He even offered to pay the U.S. Treasury $20 million to buy the Philippines so he could give them independence. In one of his essays lamenting American expansionism, he had this great line, "Tires the republic so soon of its mission?" So during the debate in the U.S. Senate, the arguments that we now hear about intervention, every time this question comes up, were first made. And that is really the discovery that is the center of my book. So the story of how we came to dominate Cuba and take the Philippines and so forth has been told a number of times. But what was a great surprise to me, and what led me to write this book, is the discovery that this decision was not taken lightly. The American people decided to start projecting their power to other parts of the world after a huge national debate that consumed the entire nation. And the terms of that debate are still reverberating. So let me just read you a couple of quotes from that debate. Here's Henry Cabot Lodge, I do not believe that this nation was raised up for nothing. I have faith that it has a great mission in the world, a mission of good, a mission of freedom. Sounds very familiar. Here's another senator, Albert Beveridge from Indiana. The opposition tells us that we ought not to govern a people without their consent. I answer, the rule of liberty, that all just government derives its authority from the consent of the governed, applies only to those who are capable of self-government. And so the other Republican senator from Massachusetts, George Frisbee Hoare, who was the leader of the anti-imperialists, shouted back, "You have no right at the cannon's mouth to impose on an unwilling people your Declaration of Independence and your Constitution and your notions of freedom and notions of what is good." Here is another one of the Boston anti-imperialists at the first anti-imperialist meeting in American history, June 15th, 1898, at Faneuil Hall in Boston. The policy of imperialism threatens to change the temper of our people and to put us into a permanent attitude of arrogance, testiness, and defiance toward other nations. Once we enter the field of international conflict as a great military and naval power, we shall be one more bully among bullies. We shall only add one more to the list of oppressors of mankind. So these are the arguments that are still shaking our political system. The debate that lasted 32 days in the U.S. Senate is absolutely riveting. As I was reading the congressional record, I had the feeling I might have been the first person in 50 years to have read through these pages. This episode is a hugely important one in American history, but it's completely forgotten. I never even realized that this debate ever happened. And my book is an effort to bring it back to life, and particularly to tell people who are unhappy with American foreign policy that you didn't just arrive on the scene and are making up these arguments for the first time. You are in a rich American tradition that goes back 120 years. Another thing I found fascinating about this great debate that resulted in this huge shift that is still shaking the world is that the decision was made by such narrow margins. So the vote in the U.S. Senate to ratify the Treaty of Paris and allow the U.S. for the first time to take foreign countries was passed with one vote more than the required two-thirds majority. Then the Supreme Court was asked to rule whether it was constitutional for the U.S. to rule other peoples and not grant them constitutional rights. Had the court accepted the principle that that was not constitutional, the entire colonial project would have been impossible. So the court approved American expansionism by a vote of 5-4. It was just that one vote margin that made this possible. Interestingly enough, the judge who wrote the majority decision saying that it was constitutional for the U.S. to rule foreign peoples without giving them rights had also supported the Plessy versus Ferguson decision a couple of years earlier, in which the Supreme Court certified the legality of segregation. It made sense, because if you believe that not everybody who lives in the U.S. deserves the same rights, you could also say the same thing about people in other countries. The closeness of this debate reflects the fact that Americans have never been able to resolve in our own minds whether pushing our coercive power into other countries is wise or not. Does it work or doesn't it work? Americans tend to have cycles in our interventionism. At some points, we're filled with anger and righteous indignation. We crash into other countries and try to impose our will. Slowly, we begin to see the blowback and the sorrows of empire, and we cool down, so we stop doing it for a while, but then the cycle begins again. And rather than seeing this as a pendulum shift, I tend to think it reflects divided halves of our conflicted American soul. We really do want to let everybody in the world do what's best for them and guide themselves. On the other hand, we also want to guide them. These are not compatible ideas, but we still hold both of them. We've never decided what John Winthrop meant way back in 1630 when he had that famous line, "We shall be as a city upon a hill, and the eyes of all people are upon us." So did he mean we should go out into a sinful world and redeem it? Or did he mean the opposite? We should build a virtuous society at home and make it into an example for others. We still can't decide what he meant. So from the history of this debate, I try to take forward the story of how the interventionist and anti-interventionist impulses have shaped American life. My last chapter tries to take the story up to the modern day. So the story of this great debate ends in about 1902. And it's a really stirring story. One of the things that's so impressive about it is that the senators were so articulate in those days. They're so sophisticated. The debates are full of references to the fate of Rome and the Catiline conspiracy and Pliny the Elder, why Persia was not able to succeed in the Peloponnesian War, things that you would never imagine senators talking about today. So it really is thrilling to see that even the bad guys were brilliant in those days. Now even the good guys are not so smart. So in the last chapter, I try to take the story up to the present day and try to look at the various presidents briefly and see which ones of them were the most interventionist and the least interventionist. I come up with an interesting conclusion of who was the most anti-interventionist president in American history, but I think I'm going to let you look that one up in the last chapter. I think the conclusion of the great debate at the beginning of the 20th century gave us certain fundamental principles that still shape our foreign policy. The central one is that America is the world's indispensable nation, that we need to lead the world, that this leadership requires toughness, and that this toughness is best shown by the threat or the use of military force. A flood of other assumptions undergird this principle. The United States is inherently virtuous. Its effect on other countries is always or usually benign. We often have to intervene in foreign conflicts despite our reluctance because the cost of inaction is just too high. The risks are too great. We'd like support from others, but actually we know better, and if other countries don't want to join us because they can't see as clearly as we can, we're going to have to go ahead anyway. We don't see the world as a wide spectrum of forces and cultures and beliefs and interests. We really see it as divided between good and evil. We jump to take the side of good, which usually brings trouble. In fact, the United States has not discovered a magic formula for prosperity and security in every country. Ideals that have worked well at home are not necessarily transferable to people in very different cultures. Many of our interventions are planned to achieve short-term objectives without any realistic goals or exit strategies. They often leave behind a trail of what we call collateral damage in the form of destroyed villages and dead civilians. The argument that our interventions tend to promote freedom usually doesn't match up with the facts on the ground, as I've often seen from covering those facts. These interventions tend to multiply our enemies, besides being hugely expensive. We used to be secure that even if there was backlash from our interventions, it wouldn't reach us because the United States is so geographically isolated, but that's over now too. So we can see that our policies over more than 100 years have set off reactions with which we are still living. Now we're able to look back at those interventions and try to draw some conclusions from them. What I'm hoping to do with this book is to frame the debate for today as it was first framed. So you will see in this book the clearest, most persuasive arguments on both sides of the issue. Because all the arguments we've been making over the last 120 years are essentially just less sophisticated repetitions of the original debate. During the writing of this book, I had the great discovery that this debate happened. That was something really new. That's the central discovery of this book. I had a few subsidiary discoveries. One of them is Mark Twain. So I grew up with the image, maybe many of you shared, of Mark Twain as a sort of gentle, grandfatherly humorist who has loved everybody and was beloved by everybody and only made gentle wisecracks that made him all the more eccentric, like your favorite uncle rocking on the front porch. But actually, Mark Twain's anti-imperialism was vituperative. He had a poison pen. And many of the statements of his that I use in this book are not in any biography of Mark Twain, and they're not in any anthology of Mark Twain's works. So his reputation has really been whitewashed. He's been, the hard edge of Mark Twain has been taken off. He wanted to change the American flag to replace the stars with skulls and crossbones. In his first speech after he returned to New York from his visit in London, he said to the horror of his audience that Americans in the Philippines were using a bandit's rifle and fighting under a polluted flag. Many people in the audience were quite horrified by this. So Twain wrote this piece that I read as almost an obituary for the United States. And think about whether this could be written today. It was impossible to save the great republic. She was rotten to the core. Lust of conquest had long since done its work. Trampling upon the helpless abroad had taught her by a natural process to endure with apathy the like at home. The government was irrevocably in the hands of the prodigiously rich and their hangers-on. The suffrage was become a mere machine, which they used as they chose. There was no principle but commercialism, no patriotism but of the pocket. So that's not the sweet, gentle Mark Twain that I had been brought up to revere. Discovering the real Mark Twain was a real fun part of this book. And my final discovery was of a person who I guess I had never really even heard of, except that I knew a high school in Chicago is named after him, and that's Carl Schurz. So Carl Schurz turns out to be one of the most fascinating immigrants to the United States during the 19th century. He'd fought in the 1848 rebellion in Germany, came to America, became an abolitionist, was a general in the Civil War, was the first German-born U.S. senator. He became Secretary of the Interior, a great crusader for civil rights and good government. In the late 19th century, Carl Schurz would have been known to every American. And so I want to conclude by reading one line from a speech that Carl Schurz delivered here in Chicago in the beginning of 1899, as this crisis, as this debate was entering its most intense moment. So Carl Schurz made this speech to the convocation of the University of Chicago. In those days, convocations at major universities were big national events, and the speeches there were considered greatly momentous. Schurz could not have known this, but on the same day he was speaking here, President McKinley submitted the Treaty of Paris for Senate ratification and set off that grand 32-day debate. Meanwhile, Schurz is here making this 11,000-word speech, laying out all the arguments against the imperial project. My publisher made me collapse down the 11,000 words to about 50. But I took the title of my book, The True Flag, from this line. And I want to conclude with it because it is an inspiration for me, and I think it should serve as an inspiration for all American patriots. Let us raise high the flag of our country, not as an emblem of reckless adventure and greedy conquest, of betrayed professions and broken pledges, of criminal aggressions and arbitrary rule over subject populations. But the old, the true flag, the flag of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, the flag of government of, for, and by the people, the flag of national faith held sacred and of national honor unsullied, the flag of human rights and of good example to all nations, the flag of true civilization, peace, and goodwill to all men. Thanks.
Stephen, thank you as always for putting history in such an exciting context. We got some questions coming in digitally. We're going to take some questions in the room. So if you have one, please raise your arm. We have microphones around. I will call on you. But as you're getting your questions ready, I'm going to read one that we got online. It's the most voted one right now, and it's a current question. Considering history, what follows a moment that we're in right now?
I'm sorry, considering history?
Considering history, what follows a moment like what we're in now?
I believe history has great lessons to teach. I don't like it when people learn the wrong lessons from history, but what I like even less, what I really hate, is the belief that we have nothing to learn from history. That the situation that the United States is in the world now is so unique that nothing that's ever happened before applies to us. I hate that idea. Nonetheless, I'm now going to say we are really in a situation that has no historical precedent, and maybe there is no lesson from history for now. One thing I do sense about President Trump is that he is a great exemplar of this syndrome I mentioned earlier of having a divided soul. So he's talked about how we're not going to have any more regime change wars and we're not going to crash into other countries where we don't have any business. At the same time, he's talked about escalating our conflicts in the Middle East and preventing China from having access to islands in the South China Sea. So he, again, is advocating directly opposing policies. How this administration is going to play out is really quite an impenetrable question, because so many of the people who are filling key positions around the president seem to disagree with his essential views. So does that mean that he's going to ignore them, or will he be guided by them? The answer to that question will have huge impact in the world, and we don't know that answer. I will say that I don't think Donald Trump is a bizarre aberration. I truly believe that he reflects a lot of who we are. He tells us more about ourselves than we would like to believe. And he's a messenger from the future. His message is, get used to me, because unless the soul of America changes, I am the new normal.
Question in the room? Right over here.
I'd like to know,
There's a microphone.
I'd like to know your opinion on how important the military-industrial complex identified by Dwight Eisenhower is, how important that is to the history of our intervention in other countries.
I think it is a central reason why we pursue this policy. Among the many corruptions of our political process that have led to a palpable reduction in the level of democracy in this country, even during what I like to think of as the brief span of my lifetime, the dramatic power of the arms industry, or what we like to call the defense industry, really stands out. So the system that it has developed to retain its grip on American politics is fiendishly simple. The amounts of money that this industry needs to invest in congressional campaigns to elect its favored lackeys is minuscule compared to the profits that are out there. So as soon as Congress votes for one of these enormously wasteful military procurement projects, the first thing the corporations that get the contracts do is divide the contract up into pieces and give each manufacturing piece to the district of another influential member of Congress. It therefore becomes impossible for these members to vote to kill these wasteful projects. I have seen an example of this near where I live in Boston. So just north of Boston is the General Electric plant in Lynn. GE is one of the 2 companies that has been chosen to make the one engine for our F-35 fighter plane, the $1 trillion project that's the most expensive military procurement project in our history. Unable to decide which group of lobbyists to give the engine contract to, we decided to give it to 2 companies, which is a complete waste. The idea is each of them should do all the work, and in the end, we'll choose which engine we want. Now, if I were the congressman from Lynn, I'd like to get up and say, this is a complete waste of taxpayers' money. We shouldn't be doing this. Choose one company and let that company do the work. But that would put at risk about 1,000 jobs in my district. Could I, in good conscience, stand up and advocate a policy that's going to throw people in my district out of work? It's a fiendishly clever system, and it definitely is a fundamental reason why the United States insists on maintaining such confrontational policies in the world. When you read these digests and magazines that circulate in the defense industry, you see the glee with which they report increasing tensions in Eastern Europe with Russia. They're always searching for new conflict zones, and they cheer whenever there's a new possibility of a war. And there's all sorts of reporting about the chances for new conflicts and upheaval, and how we can get the United States and Congress to realize that this conflict is so urgent for the United States, we need to arm that country or that force, or perhaps both. So, yes, the arms industry definitely plays a great role in this. And in fact, it brings me back to another quote from this great debate, as so many of today's conundrums do. So here is William Graham Sumner, a great figure in that era, great intellectual, the founder of the field of sociology. And not incidentally, the inventor of the term ethnocentrism. So here's William Graham Sumner speaking in 1899. The great foe of democracy now and in the near future is plutocracy. Every year that passes brings out this antagonism more distinctly. It is to be the social war of the 20th century. In that war, militarism, expansion, and imperialism will all favor plutocracy. Therefore, expansion and imperialism are a grand onslaught on democracy. Is that today or is that 1899?
All right, another question in here. I see some in the back here. Let's go right over here.
Thank you very much. This is my first program for the Council on Global Affairs, so thank you so much for being here.
What a way to start.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
I'm really stoked. I had a question about this idea of interventionalism and imperialism. Do you think that they're one and the same? And can you explain how you see this in American policy and whether there are other countries to have this sort of comparison?
No country in the world intervenes in as many countries as far away from its own borders as often as the United States does. Nonetheless, this is not a new phenomenon in history. Empires expand and contract, and that is something that has been going on since the beginning of empires. So you could argue that the United States has been an expansionist power ever since we landed at Plymouth. And we expanded to fill North America, then we expanded to be an overseas empire, then a global empire. So you asked about imperialism and interventionism. I sometimes think that the imperialists won the rhetorical war. So imperialism is not considered a word that is acceptable in common discourse in Washington, or is anti-imperialism. Another word that we really lost was isolationism. So isolationist has now become an insult. That's a negative word. The good words to promote the American exceptionalism idea are, it is the freedom agenda. It is humanitarian intervention. It is liberal hegemony. It is corporate globalism. So they won the rhetorical war. Those all sound so nice. America is always going to be intervening in the world just because of our size and our influence. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. The question is, how are we going to do it? I think our foreign policy has become dramatically militarized. We tend to use the military whenever we have a foreign policy problem. We've greatly de-emphasized diplomacy. You could argue that diplomatic projects and foreign aid is also a form of intervention, but it's a very positive form. So I like to look at military intervention, which is the most dramatic and forceful form, in this way. So I've looked at American military interventions over 100 years, probably as closely as anyone, and I can reach this final conclusion. So military intervention is always a bad idea. It always brings bad results. But that doesn't mean you should never do it. There are certain times when not intervening will produce an even worse result than intervening. And in those cases, intervention is justified. But first of all, you have to be careful in deciding which episodes fit into that category. And second, most important, you should go into the military intervention realizing this is going to bring a lot of problems. Don't come in thinking they're all going to throw flowers at us and everything is going to be lovable. Even the ones that are necessary are going to cause great trouble. So before starting them, we should make sure we have an exit strategy, and we should make sure that the American people support this intervention, and we should also make sure that there is no other way to achieve our goal other than military force. Unless we can fit those conditions, I feel we should withdraw from the idea of direct intervention.
All right. Right here in the middle in the back, Andy, I saw you next, and then we'll come to the woman next to you.
You discussed the war for America's soul. You talked about the debate back then, how much smarter it was, even though there was fake news. Now we have fake news and a dumb debate. So how do we win this war for the American soul when everybody says, you know, your former employer, the New York Times, is fake news, or everybody can choose whatever facts they have? And unfortunately, I think this is an exceptional crowd. People aren't engaging in conversations like this. And the Persians were in the Persian Wars, not the Peloponnesian Wars.
They were also involved in the Peloponnese. But now that you've mentioned the Peloponnesian War, let me tie that to something that's happening today. As you know, the great historian of the Peloponnesian War was Thucydides. And he produced a principle out of that war that we still look back on. They call it the Thucydides trap. So what he wrote is that in this war, and in all wars, and we have now seen this all the way up to World War I and so many other wars, the real situation that produces a war is when there's an established great power and another power is rising to challenge it. But he says the war does not start when the rising power attacks. It almost always starts when the dominant power becomes nervous about the rising one and then lashes out. Well, we are now in a situation like that. The challenge that China poses to the United States is unlike any challenge we have ever faced. We've never had to face a country that has more population than we have, greater, soon to be richer than we are, long tradition of cultural and political power. And our short national history tells us we only get richer, we only get more powerful. But actually that's not true. That's never been true for any empire. But I worry that the United States and Americans are not psychologically prepared for taking a role in the world other than absolute dominance. It's part of the American ethos that we dominate, we conquer, we win. And the idea that we should cede power or accept any kind of reduction, even in our relative power, is something so new for us that we're not prepared for it. History tells us that the countries and empires that survive over long periods of time, like Iran or China, are the ones that have learned to ride the currents of history. Sometimes you're up. You don't stay on top all the time. But if you can stay alive and stay together, history will come back to you.
The Chinese have learned this. The Iranians have learned this. Countries that don't learn it are doomed. And we're not prepared for that lesson yet. And that's something that I find very troubling for our future. I hope that's an indirect answer to your question.
I saw one more question in the back. The woman in the green shirt. Do you have a question or? Nope. Yeah, okay.
You made the
Nope,
statement,
there's a microphone there, please.
You made the statement that what concerns you is when people or countries learn either the right or the wrong lessons from history. My question is, who or what are the determinants of what is right and what is wrong with respect to the lessons of history?
I would like to see us look more honestly at history, including at our own history. But that's a difficult thing, not only for Americans to do, it's difficult for any country. All countries are founded on myths, and all countries have an exaggerated view of their own beneficence. People are the same way. We're all like this. We like to think of ourselves as very good. I mean, I'm a great example of this. For example, I'm a super nice guy. If you don't like me, there are only two possible explanations. One is you just don't know me. You don't know what a great guy I am. And the other is you're a jerk yourself, so you wouldn't like a nice guy like me. The idea that you know me and you know exactly who I am and you just really don't like me is not possible because I'm such a nice guy. Countries think the same way. America thinks this way. If there are people out there who don't like America, the only two explanations are their minds have been poisoned, they don't really know how good we are, or those are bad people. The idea that there are patriotic people out there in the world that know a lot about the United States, they know just who we are, and they know what we do, and they really don't like it, is something we can't grasp. That's why so many of our interventions have completely fallen out of our historical memory. I'm always impressed with the endless flood of material on World War II. The books, the movies, the video games, the TV shows. It never stops. Now, was World War II a hugely important episode? Of course. Did it shape the modern world? Yes. But I think there's another reason why we're so obsessed with it. World War II shows us the way we like to think that we are. We went into countries that were ruled by evil, cruel dictators. We crushed those dictators. We liberated suffering people. We left democracy behind and we went home. We love that story. But there are many countries that we crashed into that were relatively well-functioning democracies that we turned into cruel tyrannies or set off into fratricidal war. Those interventions have fallen out of our memory. They don't appear in history books. So I think the way to learn lessons from history is just to look honestly at what we have done and what we haven't done, what we've succeeded in and what we've failed in. Don't try to absorb the sugar-coated version of history that might be appropriate for our little children, but is not appropriate for people trying to find lessons from history.
All right, question right here. 1 second, the microphone's coming.
Thanks for your comments tonight again. You've spent a great deal of time in Central America. You've written a lot about that region. I was just wondering if you could tie the idea of U.S. interventionism with Central America and maybe give a couple episodes of it in that region. And also just a two-part question kind of on a more personal level. How did your time there, shape your career? And, what's your current relationship with that region now?
So Central America is still very close to my heart. I was the New York Times bureau chief in Managua all during the 1980s. I covered the wars in El Salvador, Guatemala, as well as Nicaragua. I'll tell you, if you live long enough, you can even see this happening. A guy that I used to hang around with is going to become a saint. How about that? A guy that I used to know in Nicaragua, Pedro Joaquin Chamorro, wound up on the money. I thought that was pretty good. A guy that I knew was on the money. But Archbishop Romero in El Salvador is going to be canonized. And now all of us reporters are figuring out which of us got pictures of us with Archbishop Romero. Certainly Central America left a great impact on me. That's a region of the world that has suffered tremendously under American intervention. And every time I hear people complaining about Russia's intervention in Ukraine, for example, or in Georgia, I tell them, it's tough to be Honduras. It's tough to be Nicaragua. Being a small country, living right next to a giant power, requires a certain dose of realism. Under the principles of Westphalia, all countries are legally equal and have the full authority to be independent in their foreign policies. But that's not really true. Honduras was not free to make its own choices, and neither is Ukraine and Georgia. That's a cruel fact of life, and Central Americans have learned it over more than a century. Nicaragua is really the country where the cycle of American intervention and withdrawal, imposition of dictators, revolution is clearer than in any country in the world. We first overthrew the government of Nicaragua in 1909. We imposed a very unpopular regime. That provoked a rebellion. We had to send American Marines in to put down that rebellion. That was in 1912. The leader of that rebellion, who was killed by US Marines, was then dragged back to his home village, and a crowd gathered around him. In that crowd was a little barefoot kid who later wrote, "Seeing Zeledon's body gave me the key to understanding the nature of American imperialism." That kid was Sandino. Sandino went on in the 1920s to forge a guerrilla force that brought the US Marines into their first major guerrilla war in the Americas. We spent years trying to crush Sandino's guerrillas unsuccessfully. Finally, Sandino agreed to a peace agreement after US troops were withdrawn. Immediately, he was assassinated on the orders of the American-imposed strongman Somoza. The Somoza family then ruled for another 40 years, great friends of the United States. That provoked the next revolution, which I covered in the 1980s, the Sandinistas. So you're taking it all the way back to 1909 as you bring up to Nicaragua today. And the tragedies you're seeing that are enveloping Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador now are also a result of American intervention. So during the 1980s, huge numbers of refugees fled from the chaos that we sowed by intervening in Central America. They wound up, many of them, in California. Their kids grew up there. They assimilated the violent gang culture of Los Angeles. After the wars were over, we kicked those people out. They went back home. That's why you're seeing these countries that were relatively placid, like Honduras, now reaching among the highest murder rates in the world. That is 100% blowback from our wars. And it's not only killing those countries and the people in them, it's producing refugee flows that are destabilizing American politics. And to answer your second question, what effect did it have on me? I think it had an important effect. Central America was not my only posting. I went on to cover Europe. I was on all the Yugoslavia wars, and I've covered Central Asia and Turkey. But I think the experience of being a foreign correspondent really has shaped my view of the world. It's not surprising. We're all products of our experience. So the people in the closed box of the Washington foreign policy echo chamber are products of their experience. They went to the same foreign policy schools, and they talk to the same people, and they go to the same luncheons, and they're members of the same foundation boards. They're products of that environment. I see the world from a different perspective. I've learned about American interventions from the perspective of the victims. And I think maybe that's what has led me to be the skunk at the garden party.
All right, we're going to do one more digital question here, which kind of builds a little bit on that. Which ideals does America hold most strongly that, in fact, translate most poorly to other cultures and nations?
It's a good question. I think the central view that we project in the world can be summarized with that horrible phrase, the world is flat. What it means is everybody wants the same things. Everybody wants the same kind of government. Everybody wants essentially what we have. So the United States, the American people have discovered the key to creating a stable, free, and prosperous society. How churlish and selfish it would be of us to keep this secret to ourselves. We have to go out and share it with the rest of the world. And the people who need our help most desperately are the ones who are so backward that they don't even think they want our help. They try to tell us they don't want us in their country. And in fact, President McKinley expressed this sentiment perfectly in a speech that he gave at the height of this debate. He was trying to explain how it is right for Americans to be in the Philippines shooting down soldiers who honestly believe that they're fighting for their own freedom and independence. And here's McKinley in a line which you can see echoing right up to today. Did we need their consent to perform a great act for humanity? We had it in every aspiration of their minds, in every hope of their hearts.
All right. Let's do some more questions in the room. I see right here, and then we'll go here next.
The debate you've described for 120 years has been closely accompanied by strands of American Protestant, evangelical Protestantism. On the one hand, a kind of aggressive messianic approach, followed by more pacifist. Sometimes that becomes a veneer over kind of brute political, commercial strength, but sometimes really passionately held by the leaders. One thinks of Wilson or George W. Bush. So how do you read that ebb and flow, and to what degree has it been a reflection of more political energy? To what degree is it motivated these debates?
We have a missionary impulse. We want to go out and save the world. We feel that we have truths we want to bring to others, and this is definitely related to our religious background. Now, Calvinism does teach you two fundamental principles. One is that there's good and evil in the world, not that there's a spectrum of everything, which is what people in many other cultures are taught. And also Calvinism teaches us that it's not moral to sit at home and just hope that things get better where people are suffering. You have to go out and commit yourself to helping them. So there's a dark side to the missionary impulse. Wilson was a great example. So Woodrow Wilson came to power on the principle of self-determination. Countries should rule themselves. Peoples should rule themselves. As a matter of fact, it turned out that he only wanted self-determination for very specific people. And he didn't want it for the Koreans, he didn't want it for the Irish, he didn't want it for the Egyptians, he didn't want it for the Indians. And in all of those four countries, explosions of rioting broke out after the passage of the Versailles Treaty, when people realized what a hypocrite Wilson was. In fact, this great believer in self-determination and this great religious figure, in his own view, sent American troops to war in more countries than any other president in American history. George W. Bush was another one of these people who believed in Christian righteousness as a motivation for foreign policy. You know that every day in the run-up to the Iraq War, when Rumsfeld would prepare the daily briefings of how his process was going, he'd put a quote from the Bible at the top. That's what Bush wanted. Bush's view was, as he put it, if the ideals of our founding fathers are true for us, they're true for all people everywhere. In other words, there are absolute truths in the world. This is a religious-based belief. The Dulles brothers were great Christians. John Foster Dulles also used Christian theology to motivate the idea of American exceptionalism. Christian missionaries were used in China and many other parts of the world as spears for American political influence. So the missionary impulse and the sense that the United States is doing God's work is a very strong theme in this debate as it was then. How about this one? I'm going to quote you again from the Senate debate. That's the center of my book. One senator gets up and says it's not right for the United States to be expanding past its borders. And Senator Orville Platt of Connecticut gets up to respond, the literal application of the senator's doctrine would have turned back the Mayflower from our coast and would have prevented our expansion westward to the Pacific Ocean. I believe the hand of Providence brought about the conditions which we must either accept or be recreant to duty. I believe that those conditions were a part of the great development of the great force of Christian civilization on earth.
All right, the question's still over here? Right.
Thank you. I was listening to an interview this morning with former finance minister of Ukraine, and amidst talking about possible U.S. intervention there, she made a comment that struck me, and it was that her children on the weekends would go to the rehabilitation hospital in Ukraine and see the Ukrainian soldiers who had been wounded, and that this connected them to the conflict. And it struck me because I think most of us are peripherally at best connected to U.S. interventions. Maybe I pay slightly higher taxes because we're intervening somewhere, or maybe there's a slightly higher chance that there's a terrorist attack, but I don't really feel it. So is there a way to convey the true cost of these interventions to Americans so that we can make more informed decisions?
That is a great question, and it's the reason why under the Bush administration it was forbidden to show photographs of the coffins of American soldiers coming back home, because we don't like to confront the cost of our wars. I'm reading now the coverage of this attack we're sponsoring on Raqqa in Iraq, and comparing it to the attack quite comparable on East Aleppo. In East Aleppo, these attacks were described as, in the most barbaric terms, as the most savage attacks on civilians, whereas our attacks on Raqqa are described as clearing out terrorists, and the civilians are being killed, are being cruelly used as human shields, so there's nothing we can do about it. So the coverage is quite different. I do think that one of the great problems we have in confronting the reality of our position in the world is that we've separated the military from American life. The cost of war is borne by something like 1% of the American population. I want to tell you a story that goes back all the way to the time when I was in college during the Vietnam War. In those days, there were two principles everybody believed in: end the war in Vietnam and end the draft. They went together. There was only one political figure in America that didn't agree that they both went together. And that guy came to speak at my college. That was Ted Kennedy. And that was the first question. How can you be against the war, but you're for the draft? And he said, I still remember this, it was a huge hall. He said, how many people in this room are in favor of abolishing the draft? Everybody raised their hand. And then he said, if the draft is abolished, how many of you people will volunteer? Nobody raised their hand. He said, that's why we need a draft. So people like you will be in the Army, and your parents will be aware of what's going on and will care about it. So I am hoping that maybe the conflicts that are starting to emerge in Washington are going to produce a wave of resistance and protest, something like we haven't seen for many, many years. And I hope that this protest will focus in part on the cost of foreign wars. I don't think you can separate the fact that we have hundreds of military bases in scores of countries around the world, and we're spending trillions of dollars to prosecute wars and maintain those establishments, from the dissolution of our domestic polity. They are connected. The amount of money that we're spending on foreign wars and on armaments makes it impossible for us to address our needs at home, particularly when we're not willing to tax the great wealth that has accumulated within a small portion of our population. So the question you ask is a very serious one. How can we make Americans more aware of the true cost of our interventions? I'm hoping that maybe even the outcry over the ban on refugees is going to focus a little attention on the fact that these people in the rest of the world are actually victims of terror. They are not the terrorists. And I hope it will help us realize that with our actions, we help create these flows that disrupt our politics. The refugee flows and the upsurge in terrorism is a reaction to what we have been doing. Therefore, if we stop doing that, things may calm down. I'm hoping also that with the breakdown of traditional coverage of international news, a new wave of foreign reporting will emerge in which people will be able to get on the ground, people will be able to see more reporting from people who live in the target countries, and maybe escaping from the tyranny of editors can have a good side in the sense that it will allow people who are off the political paradigm to have more access to the American people, as long as the American people are open to it.
All right, we have just less than 5 minutes, so let's go in here. We'll go to Madeline Gallison, the guy next to him. The man next to him will ask both your questions at the same time. Sorry. Yep.
Sir, will the reintroduction of the draft lead to fewer interventions?
No, let's get her question too. Right, yep, right here. Thanks.
So many Americans are raised on what I call the Superman principle. Cape blowing in the wind, hands on hips, in what we now call the power pose, truth, justice, and the American way. And they don't seem to understand that other cultures have their own way of functioning.
First, let me answer very simply that question. Yeah, I do believe that if there were a military draft, we would be less likely to enter foreign wars because people outside the career military would be more focused on whether these were really worth fighting. As for your final comment, I'd put it this way. In the writing business, you're never supposed to use cliches in what you write, but like people in every business, we have our own cliches. One of them is, every story is either happy or sad depending on where you end it. Now, when the United States intervenes in another country, we have the military power to achieve our short-term goal. We can always overthrow a Saddam Hussein or a Gaddafi. And if only we could get the story to end there, everything would be great. But history doesn't stop like that. I take you back to Iran, 1953. We had a great result of our coup. We got rid of a guy we didn't like, Mossadegh, and we replaced him with a guy, the Shah, who would do everything we wanted. Seemed like the perfect solution. Well, when you look back at it now and you see all the trouble that it has caused to Iran and all the trouble Iran has caused to the world, it doesn't look so successful. So I think the answer is for us to realize that blowback is a huge phenomenon. We've had enough experiences now to realize this. It doesn't mean you should never intervene or never use military power. But what it means is every time you make a major foreign policy decision, you have to stop and think what all the repercussions will be, how everyone else will react, and how you will then react to their reactions. As you point out, this is something difficult for Americans to do. In the run-up to the Iraq War, the State Department under Colin Powell produced an entire heap of reports called the Future of Iraq Project on what we should do with the water system in Iraq, what we should do with the electricity, what we should do with the gas distributions, who's going to run the police. Donald Rumsfeld threw those reports out of the building. He didn't want to participate in the Future of Iraq Project, and his reason was very simple. You're telling us, he was saying, that there's going to be trouble, that we're going to have lots of problems to deal with after we get into Iraq. That's not going to happen. Don't be negative. Be positive. This is the American way. The can-do mentality is a great thing. It's what built America. But the can-do mentality has a negative side because it tells us that no matter what cultures exist, no matter how deeply rooted they are, no matter how strongly people in the world believe other things, if we want to change them, we can do it. And as long as Americans believe that they can reshape everything in the world without taking into account what people in other countries think, believe, and want, we are not going to escape from the troubles we're in now. I think on that note, we've milked it for just about all we can. Go forth and intervene no more.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. The book is for sale over here, and Stephen will sign it.